He must have sensed that there was danger in the air, and he wanted to make sure everyone knew he meant business. It was a tense moment, and I could feel the weight of the situation. Foster was a man of action, and his courage was contagious. I forgot that I was a part of this, and not just a spectator. "Foster, you've shown your cards," spoke Barkley, his voice low and carrying throughout the room. "Any honest citizen of Linrock can see that your hand is a damn poor one. You're going to hear me speak plainly. Your accusations against my office are baseless. In the 2 years that I've been mayor, we have made progress in combating rustlers. Linrock is no longer a safe haven for them. As for sending prisoners to Del Rio or Austin, we have a small jail that is not equipped for long-term holding. We have had to rely on neighboring towns for that. There have been unfortunate incidents in our town, but we have done our best to bring the perpetrators to justice. As for the lawsuits in my court, I assure you that they were handled fairly and impartially. I do not play favorites. I will not stand for these baseless accusations any longer. If you have evidence of any wrongdoing on my part, then present it. Otherwise, I suggest you leave this hall and let us get back to the business of running this town." Barkley paused, his eyes scanning the room. The tension was palpable, and I could sense the anger simmering just below the surface, but no one made a move. "Foster, you have had your say," continued Barkley. "Now it's time for me to speak. I have worked tirelessly to make Linrock a safer and more prosperous place. I will not let your words tarnish my reputation. If you have any real concerns, then bring them to me in private, but do not come into my hall and make baseless accusations." Barkley's words hung in the air, and I could sense that the crowd was starting to turn against Foster. He had overplayed his hand, and now he was paying the price. The meeting ended without any further incident, and as I made my way out of the hall, I couldn't help but feel a sense of relief. The tension had been thick, but Barkley had handled it with aplomb. He was a true leader, and I knew that Linrock was in good hands. Chapter 3. As Foster exited the hall, shoving Rasmussen ahead of him and creating a path through the throng of people, it became impossible to keep an eye on everyone. However, he appeared to disregard the individuals trailing behind him at this point. Any friend of Rasmussen's among the dangerous crowd could have pulled out a gun. I wondered if Foster was aware of my watchful eye on those men behind him. If any of them made a sudden move, it would have been fatal. However, I realized that Foster trusted the effect his bravery had on people. It was his ability to intimidate regular men that explained his many accomplishments. Yet it was his courage to confront desperate men that made him exceptional. The group followed Foster and his prisoner down the main street, observing him secure a team and a buckboard before driving off toward Sanderson. Only then did the crowd seem to fully comprehend what had transpired. Finally, my opportunity presented itself. From the silence of some men, I sensed something important. From the hurried departure of others, I gathered that something significant had taken place. From the hushed, whispering lips of others, I heard words that I needed to hear. To my surprise, the smaller part of the crowd was the violent, threatening, and complaining group. Thus I separated Linrock into two parts, the lawless and the ones who wanted law. However, for some reason, the latter group did not dare to speak up. How could Foster and I convince them to join our cause openly? If we could do so, Linrock would be free of violence before the year was up, and Captain Neal's ranger service would be saved for the state. I went from place to place, corner to corner, and bar to bar, watching, listening, and recording. It wasn't until long after sunset that I returned to the ranch. The excitement had preceded me, and everyone was speculating. I hurried through my supper to escape the questioning and continue my espionage. Finally, I went out to the front of the house. The warm evening air wafted through the open doors of Barkley's large sitting room, casting a soft twilight glow over the space. The only illumination came from a few lamps scattered about, their light flickering in the shadows. Barkley and Darling were nowhere to be found, having not returned for supper. I longed to eavesdrop on their conversation and made plans to do so once they returned. When the sound of a buckboard drew near and they stepped out, I hid myself in the bushes, catching only a fleeting glimpse of Barkley as he entered the house. He seemed calm and collected, dignified even in the face of insult. I missed my chance to observe Darling as they entered the house without a word and shut the door behind them. I stationed myself on the porch, hidden in the shadows near a window, hoping to hear what Barkley and Darling might say about Foster if they visited the girls that evening. I needed to know whether Diane Barclay had been told the truth about him. I waited patiently in the darkness, accustomed to this sort of stakeout, until I saw the small lamp inside flicker to life, signaling someone's approach. I heard Miss Barclay's anxious voice. "Something's happened, surely, Gwen. Papa just met me in the hall and didn't speak. He seemed pale, worried." Gwen replied, "Cousin Reuben looked like a thundercloud. For once he didn't try to kiss me. Something's happened." "Well, Diane, this has been a bad day for me, too." I couldn't help but feel a twinge of sympathy for Gwen. Her sigh was so full of pathos that it brought me out of my own unpleasant task of spying and speculating. Diane responded in an amused tone. "Bad for you, too?" "Oh, I forgot to mention earlier, you and Tim had a fight," said Diane. "A fight? We fought like crazy. I never want to speak to him again," replied Gwen. "So your little fling with Tim is over?" asked Diane. "Yes," sighed Gwen. "It started fast and ended quickly. We don't really know much about Tim." "Diane, I have to admit, despite everything, I respect him now. I cared about him a lot," added Gwen. "My dear, your love interests are like summer flowers. I thought your flirting with Tim might lead somewhere, but he seems so different now from when we first met him. Occasionally I get the impression I had of him after he saved me from violence. He's strange. Maybe it's because of his infatuation with you. He's in love with you, and I'm afraid of what may come of it," said Diane. "Diane, mark my words, he'll do something terrible to Reuben," whispered Gwen. "He promised he would if Reuben tried to get with me again." "Oh, dear Gwen, what can we do? These men are wild. Reuben makes my life miserable, and he teases you," replied Diane. "I don't call it teasing. Reuben wants to be intimate with me. He'd chase after any woman," declared Gwen. "That's not a very flattering compliment to me, Cousin Gwen," laughed Diane. "I disagree," said Gwen stubbornly. "It's true, he's infatuated, and when he's drunk and tries to kiss me, I can't stand him." "Gwen, it seems like you want Tim to do something terrible to Reuben," said Diane, half-jokingly. "Part of me does, and part of me doesn't," replied Gwen. "But I'm scared of Tim. I have a feeling something's going to happen between him and Reuben." Suddenly they heard quick footsteps in the hallway. Diane thought she recognized them. "Hey, girls!" Darling's voice sounded different, lacking its usual cheerfulness. There was a pause, and I could imagine the expression on Darling's face turning sour. "Reuben, what's wrong?" Diane asked after a while. "I've never seen Dad like this before, nor have I seen you so worried. Tell me, what happened?" "Well, Diane, we had a problem today," replied Darling, letting out a blunt and expressive laugh. "Problem?" both girls echoed curiously. "Problem? We had to face a terrible injustice," added Darling, his voice becoming more passionate. "Listen, girls, I'll tell you everything." He coughed, clearing his throat in a way that indicated he had been drinking. I hid deeper in the shadows, preparing to listen intently. One slip of the tongue from Darling could give Foster the lead he needed. "It happened at the town hall," Darling began quickly. "Your father, Judge Owens, and I were there having a meeting with 3 ranchers from out of town. Suddenly we heard gunshots from somewhere, but they weren't close by. Then we heard loud voices outside. A crowd had gathered outside the hall, and men were running in shouting. We thought there was a fire. Then Ranger Foster walked in, dragging a guy named Rasmussen. We couldn't hear what was being said because of the noise. Finally, your father restored order. Foster had arrested Rasmussen for allegedly assaulting a restaurant owner named Dempsey. But Dempsey didn't accuse anyone and didn't know who had attacked him. Rasmussen was clearly innocent and was released. But then this gun-toting ranger pulled his guns on the court and stopped the proceedings." When Darling paused, I heard him take a deep breath. He was far from calm. Foster had the entire hall in a state of panic as he hurled insults at everyone. He claimed that law was a joke in Linrock and that the court was a sham. He insisted that there was no law to be found in the town. Foster even went as far as to say that Diane's father, who was the mayor, should be impeached. According to him, the mayor only made arrests for minor offenses and was too afraid to deal with the rustlers, highwaymen, and murderers. Foster believed that the mayor either didn't care or was too scared to act. The ranger also accused the mayor of using his position to cheat ranchers and cattlemen out of their money in lawsuits. Diane was deeply disturbed and angry at Foster's words. She couldn't believe that someone would insult her father in such a way. Darling, who was also present, explained that Foster was a ranger and that the ranger service wanted to rule western Texas. He claimed that many rangers were just as bad as the outlaws they hunted, and some were even former outlaws themselves. Foster was one of the worst rangers, according to Darling. He was smart and cunning, which made him even more dangerous. Darling was convinced that Foster wanted to kill the mayor and would have done so if the mayor had made any sudden moves. Diane was outraged by Foster's behavior and called him a ruffian. Darling tried to console her by saying that Foster had failed in Linrock and was desperate for attention. He also pointed out that Foster was known for seeking notoriety and making inflammatory statements. Darling was worried that Foster's words would turn the people of Linrock against the mayor and make enemies for them. Diane was not afraid of Foster's insinuations and stood up for her father. She didn't care what Foster said and was confident that her father had done nothing wrong. She was determined to protect her family's reputation and wouldn't let Foster's words get to her. After a moment of consideration, it was clear that no one would be influenced by Foster's accusations. "Don't worry, Reuben," said the concerned Darling. "Tell Papa not to worry. After all these years, he can't be hurt by the words of an adventurer." Reuben disagreed. "Yes, he can be hurt. The frontier is a strange place. There are many bitter men here, men who have failed at ranching, and your father has been exceptionally successful. Foster has spread some poison, and it will spread." There was a brief silence, during which Darling paced the floor, visibly worried. "Cousin Reuben," Gwen suddenly asked, "what happened to Foster and his prisoner?" Gwen's inquisitive nature and changing points of view made it typical of her to ask a question that would be unpleasant for Darling to answer. I was amused and thrilled at the same time. Gwen may have been a flirt, but she was no fool. "What happened to them? Ha! Foster bluffed the whole town, at least all of those who had heard the mayor's order to discharge Rasmussen," growled Darling. "He took Rasmussen and rode off to Del Rio to jail him." "Reuben!" exclaimed Diane. "So this ranger was able to arrest Rasmussen, the man who Father discharged, and take him to jail?" "Exactly, that's the toughest part." Darling trailed off abruptly, then broke out fiercely. "But by God, he'll never come back." Darling's slow pacing quickened, and he left the parlor, leaving behind a silence that spoke volumes about the impact of his ominous prediction. "Gwen, what did he mean?" asked Diane in a hushed tone. "Foster will be killed," replied Gwen just as quietly. "Killed? That magnificent man? Ah, I forgot. Gwen, my thoughts are jumbled. I should be happy if someone kills my father's defamer, but oh, I can't be. This bloody frontier is making me sick. Papa doesn't want me to stay for good, and no wonder. Should I go back? I hate to show cowardice. You know, Gwen, that Texas Ranger really caught my eye. I have to admit I was impressed by him. He had this incredible presence about him, but it's crazy to think that such a great man could be so corrupt at heart. It's hard to believe how little we truly know about people. I had this whole dream about Vaughn Foster, and now I'm ashamed of myself for even thinking about it." The next morning I woke up feeling like my old self again. I was active and engaged, and I had a feeling that big things were on the horizon. Gwen was still on my mind, but more as a source of sadness than anything else. Maybe my failure as a lover would lead to success as an officer. I put my thoughts about Barkley and Darling on hold until Foster returned. I wasn't worried about Darling's comment that Foster might not come back. I'd heard plenty of rumors like that about rangers before, but I didn't see anyone in Linrock who could take down Foster. Since Miss Barkley and Gwen weren't interested in riding, I had even more freedom to explore. I headed down to town and walked into Jim Dempsey's place, whistling cheerily. Jim always welcomed me, both for my company and for the money I spent. I bought a handful of cigars and gave some to Jim. "How's it going, Jim?" I asked. "I'm feeling as well as can be expected," he replied. Jim had a bandage around his head, but it didn't cover the lump where he'd been hit. He looked a little pale, but he was still sharp. "That was a terrible hit Rasmussen gave you," I said, still cheerful. "Listen, Jim, I ain't accusing Rasmussen," I said, looking at him thoughtfully. "I know you're a good sport and wouldn't send someone up for nothing. But let me tell you, Rasmussen got what he deserved. I saw the look on his face when he spoke at Barkley's court. He lied, plain and simple, and if it was me instead of that ranger, I would have settled it with Rasmussen myself." Jim seemed agitated by my strong statement of friendship. "Hey, Tim, that's between us, okay?" I continued. "I'm not a fool, and even though I talk a lot when I'm drunk, I know when to keep my mouth shut. In some parts of Texas, it's smart to stay quiet. And between you and me as friends, I'm leaning towards Foster's side of the fence. I lit a cigar and noticed Dempsey give a quick start as if he had just had a sudden realization. I turned to him and met his gaze. I had a feeling I had uncovered something important. "It's funny, Tim, seeing as you're siding with the gang Foster's bound to fight," Dempsey remarked. "Yeah, well, I'm a gambler at heart," I replied. "If I can't gamble with gentlemen, I'll gamble with rustlers." Dempsey gave another slight start and hid his eyes. "Well, Tim, I've heard you're pretty slick," he said with a dry laugh. "You catch on quick, Jim," I said, a sly smile spreading on my face. "I'm good on the draw with cards and guns, and soon enough I'll have a chance to prove it." Dempsey chuckled. "I reckon that talk's just hot air," he said. But I knew better. I had a feeling that soon enough Dempsey would see just how good I was on the draw. "You're leaning towards the ranger's side of the fence," said one man to another. "But Jim, wasn't he game? What did you think of that stand? He bluffed the whole gang. The way he called Barkley, why, it was great. The justice of that call doesn't bother me. It was Foster's nerve that got me. That would warm any man's blood," replied the other man. There was a little red in Dempsey's pale cheeks, and the first man saw him swallow hard. "Say, don't you work for Barkley?" he asked. "Me? I guess not. I'm Miss Barkley's man. He and Darling have tried to fire me many times." "That's so?" Dempsey said curiously. "What for?" "Too many silver trimmings on me, Jim, and I pack my gun low down." "Well, those two don't go together out here," replied Dempsey. "But I haven't seen anyone shoot off the trimmings." "Maybe it'll commence, Jim, as soon as I stop buying drinks. Talking about work, who would you say Rasmussen works for?" "I didn't say," replied Dempsey. "Well, say so now, can't you? Jim, you're powerful peevish today. It's the bump on your head. Who does Rasmussen work for?" "When he works at all, which sure isn't often, he rides for Barkley." Seems to me, Jim, that Barkley's the whole circus round Linrock. I was sore the other day to find I was losing good money at Barkley's faro game. Sure, if I'd won, I wouldn't have been sorry, eh? But I was surprised to hear some scully say Barkley owned the Hope So dive. "I've heard he owned considerable property hereabouts," replied Jim constrainedly. "Humph again. Why, Jim, you know it. Only like every other scully you meet in this town, you're afraid to open your mouth about Barkley. Get me straight, Jim Dempsey, I don't care a damn for Colonel Mayor Barkley. I wouldn't hesitate to pull a gun on him just as fast as I would on any rustler in Pecos," I said with a hint of bravado. "Talk is cheap, kid," Dempsey replied dismissively, but his face flushed with anger. I know, I said, trying to calm myself down. "Sometimes my temper gets the best of me." "But, Jim, not everyone knows that Barkley owns the Hope So, right?" "Oh, it's well known in Pecos," Dempsey said. "But Barkley's name isn't directly connected to the place. Blandy runs it." "I can't stand Blandy," I said. "His faro game is rigged, or I'm a crazy horse. I know there are plenty of crooked dealers out there, but Blandy is a snake. He never looks you in the eye and always has a sneaky way about him. The Hope So should be run by a stand-up guy like you, Jim." "Thanks, Tim," Dempsey replied, his voice a little hoarse. "Did you know that I used to run the place?" "No way," I exclaimed. "You did?" "Yep," Dempsey said. "I built the place, added onto it twice, and owned it for 11 years. "Well, I'll be damned," I said, genuinely surprised. "Why aren't you running it now, then?" "I lost it," Dempsey said, his voice heavy with emotion. "It was 2 years ago in March. Barkley and I were in a big cattle deal together. We got the stock, but my share of 1,800 head was rustled. I owed Barkley, and he pushed me. It ended up in a lawsuit, and I lost everything." Looking at Dempsey, I could see the pain and defeat in his eyes. Despite his failure to meet his obligation, he had been swindled, and it was clear that it still hurt him deeply. All that he had been suppressing, all the passion that would have been evident if his spirit hadn't been broken, was exposed for me to see. Now I understood the reason for his bitterness. However, I didn't want to inquire about his reluctance and fear, or openly accuse Barkley just yet. I figured I would consult with Foster and learn more at a later time. "Jim, that was some hard luck. It sure was tough," I sympathized. "But you're taking it like a champ. The wheel turns." "Now, Jim, the real reason I came to see you is because I need some advice. I have a little money saved up, and I want to invest it. I was thinking of buying some stock, or maybe even investing in a rancher's herd. But I need your help finding an honest and trustworthy rancher. I don't want to make any deals with rustlers who ride in the dark. I have a hunch that Linrock is full of them." "Well, Tim, I'm lucky enough to know a couple of ranchers who are above suspicion," Jim replied emotionally. "Frank Morton and Cy Zimmer have been my friends and neighbors for as long as I can remember, and they're still my friends. You can trust them, but if you want my advice, I wouldn't invest in any stock right now." "Why not?" "Because any newcomer who buys stock in Pecos these days will get rustled quicker than they can say Jack Robinson. The new cattlemen and pioneers are easy targets, but they have to learn the ropes. They don't know anyone or anything, and the old ranchers are wise and angry. They would fight if they—" "What?" I interrupted. "If they knew who was rustling the stock?" "No. If they had the nerve. Not necessarily." "What then?" As I left Dempsey's, the word leader echoed through my mind. I imagined a group of rugged, determined cattlemen riding fearlessly behind Vaughn Foster. Lost in thought, I strolled past my old haunts until a booming voice interrupted my musings. It was Morton, the rancher Jim had mentioned to me before. He was a jolly man with a robust frame and a ruddy face. After exchanging greetings, I suggested we grab a drink. Morton declined, citing his responsibilities on the ranch. I jokingly asked if he would sell me his land, but he laughed and said he wished he could. As his horses grew restless, I confided in him that I had some money to invest in stock. He seemed skeptical of me at first, but I assured him that I was sober and sincere. I challenged Morton's assumptions about me, insisting that he had misjudged my intelligence and potential. Although he seemed interested in my proposal, he remained cautious. I persisted, eager to prove myself and make a deal. The cards had been running lucky for me, and I didn't want to squander my chance at success. "Can you set me up as a stockman with my own little herd?" I asked, hoping to start my own business. Morton looked at me skeptically. "It's strange to hear this coming from Barkley's cowboy," he remarked. "I'm not part of his outfit. My job is with Miss Barkley. She's great, but her father? No way. He's been after me for weeks. I won't last long. That's why I want to start up for myself." "Dempsey sent you to me, didn't he?" Morton asked, referring to Jim Dempsey. "Poor old Jim. Well, Tim, to be honest with you, it would be foolish to buy cattle now. I don't want to take your money and see you lose out. You'd be better off going back across the Pecos where the rustlers aren't as strong. I haven't had more than 2,500 head of stock for 10 years. The rustlers let me keep a breeding herd. Kind of them, isn't it?" "It's kind of them, but all I hear about is rustlers," I replied impatiently. "I haven't lived long in a rustler-run county. Who's leading the gang anyway?" Morton looked at me with an amused smile. "I hear a lot about Jack Blome and Snecker. Everyone calls them out-and-out bad. Do they lead this mysterious gang?" "I think Blome and Snecker like to think of themselves as boss rustlers, like gun throwers," Morton said. "But that's just for show. The real brains behind the rustler gang hereabouts are much smarter than that." "Maybe Blome and Snecker are just distractions," I suggested. "Perhaps there's more to this rustler gang than just their fame." Morton snapped his jaw shut, holding back any impulsive words. "Listen, Tim, I may be young west of the Pecos, but I'm not inexperienced. I can see ahead. No matter how strong these rustlers are, how hidden their work, or how involved they are with supposedly honest men, they can't last forever." "They've been around since the pioneers came," Morton countered, "and they'll keep going as long as there's a single steer left." "Well, if you're going to look at it like that, I'm just going to assume you're one of them rustlers." Morton's face twisted with anger, and for a moment I thought he was going to hit me with his whip. But then he seemed to realize how foolish he was being and let out a booming laugh. "It ain't funny," I continued. "If you're going to act like a coward, what else am I supposed to think?" "Act like a coward?" Morton repeated, clearly offended. "You can't fool me, kid. I know real men when I see 'em. Ain't no difference between the men here in Pecos and anywhere else. If you act like you're scared, it's just an act. You've got nerve, I can tell." I nodded, feeling a sense of pride at Morton's words. "That's right. And if you think these rustlers are going to keep me from going into business with a rancher, you're dead wrong. We need some fresh blood out here, some young guns like me to get things going again." Morton seemed to consider my words for a moment, looking like a storm cloud was brewing inside him. I could tell he was a tough old cowboy, one who had probably seen his fair share of trouble. "Well, I reckon you might be right," he finally said. "I'll look you up next time I'm in town, Tim." With that, we parted ways, and I made my way back down the street to the Hope So Saloon, feeling more confident than ever. As I walked in, I knew the tasks ahead of me were sincere but displeasing. I had to mix with a low, profane set and cultivate them. I had to drink occasionally, despite my deftness at emptying glasses on the floor, and gamble with them and strangers. I had to play the part of a flush and flashy cowboy, half-drunk, always ready to laugh or fight. It was the night of the 5th day after Foster's departure when I went to the rendezvous we maintained at the pile of rocks out in the open. The night was clear, bright starlight without any moon, making it safer to be abroad. From my covert, I had often seen dark figures skulking in and out of Linrock. It would have been interesting to hold up these mysterious travelers, but that had not been our game. I had enough to keep my own tracks hidden and my own comings and goings. I liked to be out in the night with the darkness close down to the earth and the feeling of a limitless open all around. I listened for Foster's soft step, but also for any sound, like the yelp of coyote or mourn of wolf, the creak of wind in the dead brush, the distant clatter of hooves, or a woman's singing voice faint from the town. Just when I was about to give up for that evening, Foster came looming like a black giant long before I heard his soft step. It was good to feel his grip, even if it hurt, because after 5 days I had begun to worry. "Well, old boy, how's tricks?" he asked easily. "Well, old man, did you land that son of a gun in jail?" I replied. "You bet I did, and he'll stay there for a while. Del Rio rather liked the idea, Tim." "All right there." I sidestepped Sanderson on the way back. "But over here at the little village Barkley, they call it, I was held up." "I couldn't help it, man. There wasn't no road to take," I explained to my partner. "Held up?" he asked. "Yeah, the buckboard got held up. I managed to get into the brush just in time. They started shooting too soon," I replied. "Did you get any of them?" he inquired. "I didn't stick around to find out," I chuckled. "Had to hoof it to Linrock, and it's a long walk." "Have you been to your place tonight?" he questioned. "I snuck in the back. Had to make sure no one was waiting for me in the dark," I responded. "You need to find a safer spot. Why not sleep out in the open every night?" he suggested. "Sure, that's fine on a trail, but I need food and a few comforts. I'll risk the doby for a little while longer," I explained. I recounted everything I had seen and done during his absence, holding back one thing. What I did tell him sobered him up, bringing a quiet and thoughtful mood. "That's all pertaining to our job, Vaughn," my partner replied. "The rest is just sentiment. I had a thing for that little Langdon girl, but we quarreled. It's over now, and it's probably for the best." "Did you really care for her?" I asked. "I'm afraid so. It hurts, but a love affair could have made me soft and hindered me. I'm glad it's over," he said. He didn't say anything else, but the pressure of his hand on my knee showed his sympathy. I continued, "The other thing concerns you. Remember how I overheard Darling talking bad about you to Miss Barkley? He swore you'd never come back. After he left, Miss Barkley felt bad about what he said. She thought he meant you would be killed." The conversation ended there, and we went about our business. She said she would be happy if someone killed you, but she couldn't bring herself to actually want it. She called you a bloody ruffian, yet she didn't think you deserved to be shot. She talked about the difference between your terrible character and your impressive stature. She called you a magnificent fellow, that's what she did. Then she got choked up and told Gwen something in shame and disgrace. "What shame and disgrace?" asked Foster, clearly intrigued. "What did she say?" "She admitted that she was taken with you and even had a little dream about you, and she hated herself for it." I'll never forget the look in Vaughn Foster's eyes. It didn't matter that it was dark. I could see the fixed gleam, then the leaping, shadowy light. "Did she really say that?" His voice was unsteady. "Amazing. Even if it only lasted a minute, maybe we could, if it wasn't for this awful job. Tim, have you realized yet what I have to do to Diane Barkley?" "Yes," I replied. "Vaughn, you haven't fallen for her, have you?" I couldn't interpret the terrible emotion in his eyes as anything else. He didn't answer me at all, and I thought he was going to break my arm with how tightly he was holding it. "You said you know what I have to do to Diane Barkley," he said hoarsely. "Yes, you have to ruin her happiness, if not her life." "Why? Speak up, Tim. This is like a punch in the gut. For a moment I thought you had a different plan than me. No hope. Ruin her life. Why?" I couldn't explain Foster's intense distress any other way than that the realization had brought him sharp pain that was both incomprehensible and agonizing. I couldn't tell if it was because he suddenly realized he loved Diane Barclay, or if it was because he was convinced he was fated to destroy her. But I did know that he needed to tell the brutal truth. "Dang it, Foster, you're going to ruin Diane Barclay. If you can't arrest her father, you're going to have to kill him," I warned him. "Why in God's name would I need to do that?" Foster demanded. "Because Barclay's the leader of the Linrock gang of rustlers," I explained. After that conversation, we talked about our plan of action. I urged Foster to be vigilant, to be prepared for any attack. I told him that if he got shot in a fair fight, that was just part of the job. But he couldn't let himself be ambushed or killed in his sleep. He promised me he wouldn't, but I could hear the desperation in his voice. We decided that I would work on gaining the trust of Dempsey and Morton, and then Zimmer and other ranchers who could help us. We needed to find clues to the rustler gang's guilt, and we needed a group of deputies to fight with us when the time came. Foster would be the center of attention in Linrock, so we agreed that he needed to be bold and show his nerve. The more he stood up to the rustlers, the less likely they were to ambush him. But we needed a jail to hold them once we caught them. After arresting prisoners, it was crucial to keep them contained. Otherwise, all the effort would be pointless. Using an adobe house as a jail was not an option, as it could easily be cut or torn down. It took some brainstorming, but I recalled an old stone house at the end of the main street which had been abandoned for some time. Foster agreed to rent it and hire guards to watch over and feed the prisoners. Even if they managed to escape, it wouldn't damage the principles we stood for. Foster and I both had a strong feeling that Barclay was guilty, but we needed proof. Our experience in detecting and sensing hidden guilt had sharpened our senses. Foster had made some mistakes in the past, but I had never made a single one. However, having conviction was one thing, and having proof was another. Once we had enough evidence, we faced the daunting task of capturing desperate men who were in control of a wild country. It was a challenge, but we were ready to tackle it with patience and determination. Foster and I had different motivations, but we both shared a common goal of saving the Ranger Service. Foster was passionate about upholding the law in Texas and making life safer and happier for honest pioneers. I, on the other hand, was driven by the excitement, danger, and mental challenge of the job. While I also wanted to help those in need, it was the thrill of the game that kept me going. The next morning I rode with the young ladies. Gwen's advances were persistent and obvious, but I pretended not to notice. I knew that my hard-earned self-control was in danger of slipping away. Despite this, I remained attentive and respectful, ensuring the safety of my charges. However, the carefree cowboy that I once was seemed to be a distant memory. Gwen, being the typical woman, showed some remorse for her behavior, but my indifference only fueled her desire to win me back. She was the type to value what she had lost and would do anything to regain it. I saw an opportunity for revenge, even though she had been kind to me. I couldn't forget the snide comment she made about being kissed by her admirers. Sentiment aside, I couldn't make amends with her. We stopped on a ridge to rest, and I found a shady spot under a mesquite tree. The girls wandered off, and I nearly dozed off. Suddenly I heard footsteps and rustling. Then I felt a soft thud behind me, and I jumped. It was Gwen's little hands on my shoulders, and her fragrant hair brushed against my cheek. She whispered, "Tim, don't you love me any more?" Chapter 4. That evening I caught sight of Foster at our designated spot, and we exchanged information and mulled over the intricacies of our predicament. The stone house had been rented by Foster to serve as a jail. The blacksmith was tasked with fitting a door and window that could withstand any attack. The townsfolk, including idlers and strangers, flocked to see the spectacle. It was a significant event for Linrock. Foster announced that he needed to hire a jailer and a guard. The sarcastic humor of the townsfolk made it clear that they were keen on filling these positions. Foster and I were about to part ways when I remembered Miss Barclay's upcoming party. I informed Foster, but he shook his head in doubt. Could Barclay really be a shrewd and cunning leader of cattle rustlers and still maintain his daughter's innocence and hold parties for the very people he had robbed? It was a notion that only merciless rangers could believe. Thursday evening arrived, and it was clear that the girls had different attitudes towards the party. Gwen aimed to outshine all the other young ladies and attract all the young men. Miss Barclay, on the other hand, wanted to open her father's home to the people of Linrock, to show that she could bring happiness and entertainment to what had been a long and cheerless abode. I was in the parlor carrying flowers for decoration when Miss Barkley received word that her father had ridden off with 3 unidentified horsemen. She was disappointed, but it was clear that the news had a deeper impact on her. I overheard Dick's remark about the colonel's haste, and it left me pondering. Barkley was known for his spontaneous rides, but this particular event was different. The house was lit up with every lantern and lamp available, and the cowboys arrived in their best attire, eager for the festivities to begin. Townspeople, both young and old, soon followed. Miss Barkley welcomed them all and explained her father's absence. The music was provided by 2 cowboys with banjos and an elderly man with a fiddle, and though it wasn't perfect, it was enough to get everyone dancing. As I moved from the porch to the parlor to the patio, I couldn't help but be amused by the scene before me. The bright dresses and flashy scarfs of the cowboys, along with the beautiful flowers and decorations, made for a lively and colorful atmosphere. During the dance, the sound of boots shuffling on the floor was constant, and during the breaks there was a low hum of chatter and laughter. Although I wasn't one to usually wander around, my eyes were fixed on Gwen Langdon. She was wearing a white dress with a low neckline and short sleeves, and she looked absolutely stunning. I couldn't help but feel jealous as she seemed to make sure I saw her every chance she got. Despite my jealousy, I couldn't help but be mesmerized by her beauty. As I strolled around the promenade, I noticed her arm in the embrace of some proud cowboy or gallant young buck from town. She would give them a languishing glance that probably did as much damage to them as it did to me. One day she caught me red-handed in my pursuit of her, and then, whether by intent or from indifference, she stopped paying me any attention. However, I noticed that from that moment on her gaiety gradually transformed into coquettishness and soon into flirtation. Curious to see how far she would go, I followed her shamelessly everywhere she went, even to the waltz. To her credit, she always backed off when some young fellow tried to take things too far. Young Waters was the only one successful enough to kiss her, and there was more strength in his conquest of her than any decent fellow could be proud of. When Reuben Darling sought Gwen out, my jealousy was mixed with real anxiety. I had bumped into Darling several times that evening. He wasn't drunk, yet he was under the influence of liquor. I believed that Gwen wouldn't have walked with him had she known, given her abhorrence of drink. Anyway, I followed them, staying close to the shadows. Darling was unusually happy, and I saw him put his arm around her without any remonstrance. When the music resumed, they went back to the house, and Darling danced with Gwen, not ungracefully for a man who rode horses as much as he did. After the dance, he waved aside Gwen's many partners, not as gaily as would have been consistent with good feeling, and led her away. I followed them. They ended their walk at the far end of the patio, where a small arbor had been built among the flowers and vines, lit up by brightly colored lights. Gwen's energy seemed to have diminished. As soon as they were out of my view, I heard Gwen cry out, not in alarm but in frustration. I took it as an opportunity and quickly ran back towards them, my hand on my gun. When I arrived at the arbor, I saw that Darling had been holding Gwen, but he released her when he heard me. Gwen's face turned white, and she put her hand over her chest, thinking I was going to harm Darling. I apologized, explaining that I had heard a noise and thought someone was in danger. I made an excuse for my behavior, stating that Miss Barkley had given me instructions to keep an eye out for accidents and fires. As I stepped away to my surprise, Gwen apologized to Darling and then rushed over to me. She grabbed my arm, saying it was time for our dance. She whispered to me that she was afraid of Darling and that I had scared her as well, but I reassured her that I had only been trying to keep her safe. As we walked through the patio, Gwen told me that she thought of me whenever she was frightened since we arrived. She said that she felt safe with me nearby. We stopped at the entrance to the big parlor, and Gwen stood in front of me, looking down with a flushed face. She twisted a silver button on my vest as she spoke, and I could barely hear her over the sound of the passing couples. Gwen looked as sweet as ever, and I couldn't help but feel a twinge of affection towards her. "Let's dance," she said, grabbing my arm. "Reuben chased off my partner. I'm happy for the opportunity. Dance with me, Tim, not because I asked, but because you want to. If not, don't bother." I couldn't handle much more of this. It was unlikely that I would have another evening like this, at least not in this area. I reluctantly agreed, and we entered the parlor. Amid all the chaos, she whispered, "I've been terrible to you." The dance felt like it lasted only a moment. She was light and graceful, glowing and attractive, floating near me with our hands clasped. Then the music stopped, the couples found seats, and Gwen and I were approached by Miss Barkley. She complimented us on our graceful dancing, and Gwen mentioned how she didn't have to reach up too far to dance with me. I was speechless for once and said nothing. Darling had returned and was now standing in the doorway, cigarette in his mouth, leading to the patio. At the same time, I heard heavy boots stomping on the porch, and Darling's expression changed from surprise to fear. I turned around to see Vaughn Foster leaning his head to enter from the other side. The dancers backed away, and at the sight of him I was once again the ranger, his ally. Foster was pale and sweating, without a hat, his coat turned up, and he held the lapels together with his left hand. In the ensuing silence, Miss Barkley stood up, white as her dress. The other young women gawked in amazement, and their partners were excited. "Miss Barkley, I came to search your house," Foster gasped, politely but firmly. I released my hands from Gwen's grip and stepped forward, leaving the corner. Foster was running towards us, his coat clutched tightly to his chest. I felt a sense of anticipation, knowing that something was about to happen. Miss Barkley's expression went from surprise to anger, which she struggled to control. "As my father is not here, I am in charge, and I will not allow you to search my house," she declared. Foster responded sternly, "I regret to say that I must search your house without your permission." Miss Barkley was not pleased with this response. She stood tall, her chest heaving, her eyes blazing with anger. "How dare you intrude here? You have already insulted us enough. To search my house tonight to disrupt my party is worse than an outrage. Why would you want to search here? Is it for the same reason you brought an innocent man into my father's court? I forbid you to take another step into this house." Foster's face turned pale, and I wondered if it was because of her scorn or something he was hiding under his coat. "Miss Barkley, I do not require a warrant to search houses," he said. "However, I will respect your command this time. It would be a shame to spoil your party. Let me add, perhaps you misunderstand me. I was shot by a rustler and he fled. I chased him here, and he has taken refuge in your father's house. He is hiding somewhere." Foster opened his coat, revealing a light-colored shirt that was stained with blood. Drops of dark red fell to the floor. "Oh!" cried Miss Barkley. Her anger dissipated, replaced by horror and pity as she imagined that Foster was mortally wounded. It was a gruesome sight, one that no woman should have to witness. "I can handle this. I'll find the rustler and make sure he's dealt with properly. Miss Barkley trusts me to handle this without violence, and I won't let her down." As I spoke, I could feel my anger simmering just beneath the surface. Reuben Darling had no right to question my abilities or my intentions. Gwen clung to my arm, her eyes wide with fear and excitement. "Be careful, Tim," she whispered. "I don't want anything to happen to you." I smiled down at her, my heart racing with adrenaline. "Don't worry, Gwen. I've got this." And with that, I pushed open the door and stepped out into the night. The air was cold and crisp, the stars shining brightly overhead. I could hear the distant sound of a guitar and the laughter of the dancers inside, but outside it was quiet and still. I took a deep breath and set off towards the edge of town, my eyes scanning the darkness for any sign of movement. It didn't take long for me to spot something, a shadow moving along the ground just beyond the edge of the streetlights. I froze, my hand going to my gun, and watched as the figure darted behind a nearby building. I crept forward, my heart pounding in my chest, and peered around the corner. There, huddled in the shadows, was a man. He was young, with a scruffy beard and a wild look in his eyes. "Hey!" I called out, stepping forward. "What are you doing here?" The man spun around, his hand going to his own gun. "None of your damn business," he snarled. I didn't hesitate. I drew my own gun and aimed it at him. "I think it is my business. You just shot a man, and I'm here to make sure you pay for it." The man hesitated, his eyes flickering nervously between me and the gun. "You don't understand," he said finally. "I had no choice. Foster was going to ruin everything." I frowned, lowering my gun slightly. "What do you mean? What were you trying to protect?" The man hesitated for a moment, then seemed to make up his mind. "I can't tell you," he said, "but I can promise you this. If you let me go, I'll make it worth your while." I shook my head. "I'm sorry, I can't do that. You're coming with me." And with that, I stepped forward and grabbed the man by the arm. He struggled for a moment, then seemed to give up, letting me lead him back towards town. I could hear the distant sound of shouting and gunfire, but I didn't let it distract me. I had a job to do, and I was going to see it through. "But I ain't telling you nothing. You can't prove nothing anyway." I tightened my grip on his collar, feeling my patience wearing thin. "Listen, kid, you've been rustling cattle from Miss Barkley's ranch. You can either come clean or face the consequences." He hesitated for a moment, then seemed to come to a decision. All right, I did it, but I had to. My dad's sick and we needed the money." I nodded, understanding his predicament, but also knowing that the law had to be upheld. "Well, you're coming with us. We'll let the sheriff sort this out." We led him outside, where Miss Barkley and the other cowboys were waiting anxiously. "We found him," I announced, and handed Bo over to the sheriff, who had just arrived. As they rode off, I couldn't help but feel a sense of satisfaction. Another rustler caught, another job well done. "I figured Barkley's was the safest place around," I said confidently. My companions didn't seem convinced, but they didn't know the full extent of the danger I was facing. The image of Foster's bloody chest was still fresh in my mind, and I knew I had to be careful. I couldn't reveal my true feelings or show any unusual interest in Foster, not now. When Snecker was finally captured, I played it cool and asked what Darling planned to do with him. I let Snecker go and put my weapon away. Snecker seemed relieved, and I guessed he didn't fancy the sight of a cocked gun pointed in his direction. Darling took charge and pushed Snecker into the hall. I followed them out to the back of the house and then hurried back to Miss Barkley and Gwen. They were still shaken up, but I reassured them that there wouldn't be any more trouble. Miss Barkley was curious about the rustler's identity, and I tried to deflect suspicion by suggesting he had just been looking for a place to hide. She asked if her father would have arrested him, and I replied honestly that he might have made things difficult for him. Suddenly Miss Barkley remembered the presence of the ranger and exclaimed in surprise. The sight was gruesome, blood covering the man's entire front. "How is he still standing?" I asked Tim. "Do you think it'll kill him?" "Hard to say. Foster's a tough one," Tim replied. "Please, Tim, go find him, see how he's doing," she pleaded. Glad for the chance to help, I hurried down towards town. As I approached his little adobe house, I made sure to be cautious and not draw any attention. I whistled low, a signal he'd recognize, and he opened the door for me. "Hello, son," he greeted me. "You needn't have worried. Sling a blanket over that window so no one can see in." Foster had his shirt off and was bandaging a bullet wound on his shoulder. "Let me tie that up," I offered, taking the strips of linen. "Uh-huh. Shot you from behind, didn't he?" Foster asked. "How else, you crazy lady charmer? It's a wonder I didn't have to tell you that." He recounted the circumstances of the shooting, which weren't much different from previous attempts on his life. "Snecker's a good runner if he's not a good shot," Foster concluded. I finished bandaging his wound and couldn't help but admire his strong shoulders. I noticed several scars on his skin from previous bullet wounds. I had the impression that his strength and vitality were unconquerable. "You knew it was Bill Snecker's son?" I asked, telling him about finding the rustler. "Sure. Jim Dempsey pointed him out to me yesterday." "Both Sneckers are in town. We're going to be busy from now on, Tim," Foster said. "It can't come soon enough for me," I replied. "Should I quit my job and come out from behind these cowboy togs?" "Not yet. We need proof, Tim. We've got to be able to prove things." "Let's stay at the ranch a bit longer," I suggested. Bo Snecker was clearly terrified until he recognized Darling. "Doesn't that prove something?" he asked. "No, that's not enough. We need to catch Barkley and Darling in the act," I replied. "I don't like the idea of you going alone," I protested. "Remember what Neil told me. It's time for me to stay close with a couple of guns. You'll never have to use one." "The hell I won't," Foster retorted, his passion evident. I was surprised that my comment had angered him. "You're all wrong. I know when to use a gun. Rangers have a reputation for being trigger-happy, and unfortunately it's probably accurate." "Did you shoot at Snecker?" I asked. "I could have shot him in the back, but that wasn't the right way to do it. I aimed at his legs, trying to bring him down. I would have made him tell us everything he knew, but he was too quick for me." "Shooting at his legs? No wonder he ran. He knew what you were up to. It's funny how these rustlers and gunmen don't mind being killed, but being crippled, roped, and jailed is a fate worse than death for them. So, am I supposed to continue falling in love with that sweet girl up at the ranch instead of facing things with you?" Foster chuckled, but he also took my concerns seriously. "Tim, you think you're patient, but you don't know what patience really is. I won't rush this job, but I have an idea. I'll stay hidden most of the time when you're not around. That's doable. I'll keep an eye out for you when you're in town. We'll go to the same places. And if I get busy, you can follow me discreetly. Does that work for you?" "Perfect," I replied, relieved that we had come to an agreement. "Well, I gotta head back to tell Miss Barkley that you're all right," I said to Foster. He was finishing up putting on a clean shirt, being careful not to disrupt the bandages. He stopped and turned to face me with a desperate look. "Tim, did she show any sympathy?" he asked eagerly. "She was really upset about it. She thought you were going to die," I replied. "Did she send you?" he asked. "Yep, and she said to hurry," I said, feeling a bit smug about the possibility of Foster having feelings for her too. "Do you think she would have cared if I was hurt bad?" Foster asked, sounding like a nervous kid with a blush on his face. "Care? Vaughn, you're as dense as you say I'm crazy. Diane Barkley's fallen in love with you, that's it. Love at first sight. She doesn't know it, but I do," I said confidently. Foster stood there looking like he'd been hit by a bullet straight to the heart. Maybe my words were too much, but I believed them. "Tim, for God's sake, that's a terrible thing to say," he exclaimed. "No, it's not terrible to say, it's just a terrible fact," I said. "I could be wrong, but I swear I'm right. When you opened your coat and showed your bloody chest, I'll never forget the look in her eyes. She was furious, filled with hate. Then something beautiful broke through. Pity, fear, and agony at the thought of your death. If that's not love, then I don't know what is. She thinks she hates you, but she really loves you." "Get out of here," Foster ordered, his voice thick. I left, but not before taking a quick peek out the door and listening for a moment. Then I hurried back towards the ranch. The stars shone bright and big, so calm and cold that it hurt to look at them. It made me wonder about the fate of Vaughn Foster and me. Bitterness, an emotion rare for me, crept in. Most rangers let go of love when they joined the service and rarely found it again. But love had found me, and I knew that Vaughn was in the same boat. The adventurer in me stirred as I marveled at the situation. We had fallen into a tangle of circumstances that rangers were not prepared for. I left with regret, remorse, and sorrow in my heart, but also with the excitement of the game tingling through me. I returned to the ranch feeling mischievous. I wanted to plant the same seed in Diane Barkley's heart that I had in Foster's.